This screencast introduces the metaphysical school of poetry and the poet John Donne. We begin with some historical background. When last we mentioned royalty, Queen Elizabeth I was on the throne. Remember that she was a Protestant and that there was a lot of animosity going on between Protestants and Catholics at that time. Elizabeth died in 1603, bringing James I to the throne, another Protestant. In 1605, we have the failed gunpowder plot, in which Catholic extremists try to blow up Parliament. The most famous conspirator was Guy Fawkes, and you can see him right here. And his face is the symbol of the current Occupy Wall Street movement. So James I dies in 1625 and the throne goes to Charles I, not the best king that England ever had. And that, kids, would be an example of litotes. In fact, he was a horrible king, and the only English king ever to be executed by his own people. You see, he was a Protestant like all the kings and queens had been since Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church in 1534 and formed the Church of England. But Charles I married a Catholic woman and made her queen, an unforgivable offense in the eyes of English Protestants. And besides just being a miserable king, he dissolved Parliament and generally thought of himself as God's gift to England. His actions brought about not one but two civil wars in England, which eventually ended in his beheading in 1649 and brought an end to royal rule. After Charles's death, England became a republic under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, who was named Lord Protector of the country in 1653, an office that he held until his death just 5 years later. We'll talk about Cromwell a little more when we read Milton. So, against this background of political upheaval, we have a new style of poetry coming to the forefront. It was called metaphysical poetry and was prominent in the 17th century. Metaphysical means beyond the physical, so it wants to move beyond physical attributes as a source of inspiration for poetry. Metaphysical poetry is a reaction to the romantic sonnets of Shakespeare and others like him. These poets wanted to put an end to the idea of courtly love and the idealized woman, or the woman on the pedestal, and focus instead on the everyday woman, the girl next door. They didn't use the sonnet format, and instead they employed plain language based on individual experience. This idea of plainness and experience is in fact a result of the Protestant Reformation. Consider that these poets were writing around the time that the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. A couple of things to watch for in metaphysical poetry. First, it will contain elaborate extended metaphors that work throughout the poem. These are called conceits. Just a reminder about metaphors. They are one thing described as something else. In this case, war is described as a red animal and a blood-swollen god. Neither of these things really has anything to do with war, but we can understand war itself better by thinking about it in these terms. Another thing to watch for is the use of paradox, an apparently absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition, or a strongly counterintuitive one, which investigation, analysis, or explanation may nevertheless prove to be well-founded or true. Can you see why both of these images would be a paradox? First of all, we have Pinocchio, who says, "My nose will grow now," but we know that his nose only grows when he lies. So if he's lying and saying that my nose will grow, then his nose won't grow. But a lie would cause his nose to grow. So it's round and round. It's circular. You can never come to the end of it. And then the other is a black cat carrying a four-leaf clover. So anyway, you'll find both conceits and paradoxes in the work of Donne and Marvell. So that brings us to our poet, John Donne, who lived from 1572 to 1631. Donne was a Catholic, and we know that at this time there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment running high in England. He was educated by Catholic priests before attending Oxford and Cambridge. His brother, in fact, died of a fever in prison, where he had been serving time for giving sanctuary to a Catholic priest. So his family was pretty religious in the Catholic Church. His brother's death, though, caused Donne to have a crisis of faith and to eventually leave Catholicism. So when his father died, Donne inherited a considerable fortune, which he spent on womanizing, on books, at the theater, and on travel. In other words, he wasted his inheritance. Once he got past that wild phase of his life, he served as a member of Parliament, and it all went pretty smoothly until he fell in love with Anne More in 1601. You see, Donne was 29 at that time, and Anne was only 17. And instead of taking her to the church and having a big formal wedding, uh, Donne and Anne eloped. Her father was so angry with him that he had him thrown in prison for a few weeks and even had him dismissed from his post in Parliament. The two men hardly spoke to each other until about 8 years later, but eventually it all kind of settled down, and Donne actually even became a minister in the Anglican Church. Anne died in 1617 at the age of 33 after having given birth to her 12th child. A pretty tough life. So now, read a couple of Donne's poems, The Flea and A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. Compare them to Shakespeare's sonnets. Look for conceits and paradoxes. I think that you'll find this poetry a very different animal than what we've seen before. Enjoy.